finishing up this video here, and then we can move on with our blizzard. Alright, so another group of Indians that are very much facing American animosity are a group called the Napiers. They got this name because they had pierced noses. Napiers is French for pierced nose. And so since they got a French name, there is a connection between the Napiers and the French fur trade way back during the colonial era. So that's interesting because when the Napiers first encountered white Europeans, they were peaceful, right? A lot of the French fur traders actually intermarried with the Napiers. So, you know, they were not by any means historically an aggressive people. And so, you know, one could argue that, again, this kind of creation of Indians as savage, brutal, violent might have almost been sort of caused by the U.S. treatment of the Indians, right? And at this point, a legacy of confining other groups to reservations. So the Napiers don't really have, unfortunately, a good story either. By 1863, mining companies are going to put a lot of pressure on Indians, or actually on the government directly. Mining companies want to be able to develop all these precious metals that they are discovering, but at this point, a lot of the land that holds these precious metals at this point belongs to the Napiers. So what mining companies are going to do is they're going to put increasing pressure on the government to try to purchase this land from the Napiers. And it's not even really a purchase, to be honest. What they want the government to do is to demand the Napiers to cede 6 million acres of their land. The U.S. was willing to pay for this land, but they only were willing to pay for 10 cents an acre, so not much, of course. And what happens is the Napiers are pushing back, and they don't want to cede this land for such a small price. But unfortunately, what the U.S. government does is it coerces a very small number of Napiers to sign this treaty. And the treaty, according to the Napiers, was fraudulent because the people who signed it were not leaders of the Napiers. But nonetheless, the government took that treaty to be a solid word. And what happens is the Napiers are forced into a long retreat into Canada, or not Canada. They don't make it quite there. They're actually retreating into Montana, and they have a series of military confrontations along the way. A lot of Napiers, partly due to their anger, frustration, killed several American soldiers while they were trying to march into this Montana territory. And eventually, they're going to be forced to surrender in northern Montana. So what's going to happen is that the U.S. government claims that they're going to let the Napiers move back to their native Oregon, but instead, the U.S. is actually going to round them up and send them to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and they're going to be confined to reservations. So the modern descendants of the Napiers now live in Kansas, which is very far from their home in Oregon. So another story of, again, the U.S. kind of making a sketchy treaty in this instance, trying to hold the treaty to its word, even though the people that signed it were allegedly not very powerful among the Napiers. But nonetheless, another example of very much kind of taking advantage of the Indians for their land. Geronimo, very well-known Apache leader in Indian history. He was known for his skilled raids on horseback against white outposts in Arizona. So, you know, he was sort of reinforcing the white idea about what an Indian was. Eventually, this is going to lead to a major conflict between the U.S. Army and a number of Indian groups, the Apaches, which were Geronimo's people, the Kiowas, and the Comanches. This confrontation is going to be called the Red River War. And in 1886, Geronimo and his allies are going to be forced to surrender to the U.S. Army. And by 1886, we say that the Indian Wars, which was this Red River War that I just talked about, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle at Wounded Knee, which actually I'll mention in a future slide. Ultimately, all of these conflicts are over with the surrender at the Red River War. So you may say, you know, are there any white people who are actually commenting on this in a negative way? It almost seems like manifest destiny was something that was so sort of ingrained in the American mindset that they didn't see the Indians as people, but that's not at all true. There were some white Americans who became activists for the Native Americans, and not surprisingly, many of them were female. Think about the disappointment that women were facing because they were not included in the 15th Amendment, right? So Helen Hunt Jackson, she was an American author and activist for Native Americans. And in 1881, she publishes a book called A Century of Dishonor, which is basically highlighting the last 100 years of U.S. Indian policy. And she's highlighting how the U.S. Continuously mistreats the Indians, convinces them to sign fraudulent treaties, or when it does sign a treaty that it doesn't like, it's going to renege on that treaty. Oftentimes massacring women and children in these confrontations, like in Sand Creek. So what she does is she's raising general awareness of the Indian condition in the West. So for people who live in the East who are not directly impacted by this, they're going to sort of become a little bit more alert, just like the abolitionist movement became more popular in the North. When you are not immediately surrounded by the condition, it's easier for you to sort of look at it with a critical eye. And so ultimately what we see here is that it isn't nearly as monumental as, the effect that a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin had, but at the same time, people like Helen Hunt Jackson are at the very least going to give some Americans pause about what the U.S. government is doing with Native Americans out west. And one of the more controversial policies, we already talked about Fort Laramie, which ends up, going away, was the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. So remember, by 1887, the Indian Wars are virtually over. And so now the U.S. has a little bit more of a mandate to pass very unfair legislation against the Indians. So the Dawes Severalty Act essentially forces Indians to conform to a more white way of living. What it does is it actually does provide plots of land to Indians. The land plots are fairly large, 160 acres apiece. But the thing is, the Indians could not accept this land unless they accepted it as individual families. And so if you remember, the more traditional concept of the land for the Native Americans was communal ownership, right? They didn't believe in private property the way that the white Americans did. And so ultimately, by following the Dawes Severalty Act, even if they got land out of it, they would have to use the land in a different way. So the Dawes Severalty Act was seen as a way to sort of rid Indians of their traditional culture, right? And by confining them to smaller plots of land, it certainly limited the degree of jobs that they could have. Of course, people in more nomadic groups could no longer sustain themselves in the ways that they were used to. And also, a lot of these lands that were provided under the Dawes Act were not the most profitable, fertile lands, right? And even if they were fertile and profitable, a lot of times later, speculators and the government itself could come in and essentially buy up that land at a fairly cheap price, coerce Indians into selling it. One of the more problematic effects of the Dawes Severalty Act also is that Indian boarding schools are going to be established to attempt to almost completely rid Indian children of their culture. What it did was it forcibly removed Indian children from their families and confined them into boarding schools. They were forbidden to speak in their native languages, and they were forbidden to dress in their traditional tribal outfits. So ultimately, they were trying to be westernized. They were trying to turn them into effectively white people. This was a way that the government could almost commit cultural genocide, right? By trying to, stop the traditions of Native peoples that had existed for hundreds of years. And the other thing that is less addressed with the Indian boarding schools is that oftentimes these children were physically abused and sometimes lost their lives. And so more modern archaeological excavations have actually revealed the bones, the human remains of many children who perished in these boarding schools. So there were some, we already talked about Custer's Last Stand. There are other instances of attempts to preserve a culture despite American intervention in Indian ways. So the ghost dance is one of the forms of resistance. The ghost dance actually is going to be an expression of the Sioux people because they anticipate that there's going to be a judgment day. They see all the white encroachments of their land, on their land rather, as a sign that the end is coming, which actually is not too far from the truth. And so the ghost dance was a way for them to sort of get back to their religiosity. It was their way of trying to guarantee a special place in the afterlife. And even though the ghost dance was not meant to be overtly violent towards the white people, when white people saw the ghost dance, they saw it as sort of a forewarning that there was going to be a huge Indian retaliation against the whites. So it almost gave them an excuse to try to overtly stop the Indians in their tracks, even though already there have been so many instances of white and Indian conflict. The ghost dance was seen as a threat among the whites. And it's actually going to lead to one of the most devastating massacres of Indians in U.S. history. In 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee. And what this was the U.S. U.S. civilians are going to approach a Sioux area, and they're going to basically just completely open fire upon them, even though some white men are also killed in the exchange of fire. At the end of the massacre, over 200 Sioux lay dead. Many of them were women and children. And a lot of these women and children that were killed when they were trying to run away. So it was very devastating and sort of an unnecessary massacre of people. And we could compare it to the Sand Creek Massacre that happened in 1864, again, where a lot of civilians launched this attack, where the government essentially turned the other way. Also, in some of these massacres, a lot of the white instigators had been drinking. So it kind of shows us the ruthlessness that existed there. So at this point, the legacy of American and Indian policy, unfortunately, is one of confining Indians to reservations. And so this map indicates to us the locations of Indian reservations. Many of them are concentrated in the West. What's interesting is that even Oklahoma is no longer a popular site for Indian reservations. There's one major one here, but ultimately a lot of them have been shifted to other places. Some of them actually demonstrate progress because some of these reservations are located in places where Indians traditionally name their homeland. So there is, particularly after the millennium, we do have a little bit more government attention to the needs of Indian people, the need to sort of correct some of the devastating relations that we saw in the 19th century. So some of these reservation locations are actually sort of a return to home, which is a good thing. Also, we do see attempts to remember some of the better-known heroes of Indian culture. Crazy Horse, he and Sitting Bull were two of the leaders in the battle at Little Bighorn. So Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, you could say that they were responsible for Custer's last stand. They very much resembled at least one last victory for Indian people. But what eclipses that is that a lot of the monuments that exist in the Western territories actually are still very much, traditionally American in nature. Mount Rushmore was built in an attempt to expand tourism to the region. So what's interesting here, I think, is the kind of dichotomy between, on the one hand, trying to remember the traditional people of this area, and on the other hand, sort of implanting people in this area that actually had never set foot there. Many of the men on Mount Rushmore, with the exception of Teddy Roosevelt here, people like Lincoln and Jefferson and Washington didn't really have much of an involvement at all in the West. So why are they carved into rocks in South Dakota? I don't know. Maybe it's sort of a symbol of transforming the West into more of a white man territory. Okay, let's finish up here with the romance of the West. So we already talked about this with the cowboy culture, but again, remember the traditional view of the West is one that's wild, one full of gunslingers, one full of horseback riders, right? The dichotomy between white men and Indians, right? The idea that white men are kind of allowed to disobey the law, whereas Indians are not. And at the same time, notice the absence of women. A lot of times we don't really pay attention to what is not in artistic portrayals, but women don't typically get much of a place in the traditional narrative of the West. And I want to address the position of women in the West because they are ignored, right? Let's think about how the West makes its way into entertainment. Buffalo Bill was a sort of a Western performer. He tried to sort of play upon the foreign images of the West and ended up basically amassing a large show that actually toured around the world that was supposed to celebrate the sort of Western cowboy culture. So basically, Buffalo Bill actually would go as far away as Europe and try to show off what Western culture was all about. And so there was almost this passion and interest in Western culture among other parts of the world. You know, just like nowadays I don't know, people, maybe this is old, but like how people get really into reality TV shows about worlds that are not like theirs. You know, why do people watch things like Honey Boo Boo and Jersey Shore? They are interested and obsessed with cultures that are different from them. And so ultimately in the 19th century, the West was that obsession for a lot of people that lived, you know, a little bit more established lives in cities with more traditional jobs. What's interesting actually is that there was an overlap between this sort of romantic Western culture and Indian culture. Sitting Bull, the same hero of the Custer's Last Stand, actually appeared in some of Buffalo Bill's Western tours. And so what's interesting, on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe this creates like an odd facade for people watching these. They might think that Indians are actually much happier than they really are if Sitting Bull is willing to tour with Buffalo Bill. But you could also think about it as kind of a new subjugation for the Indians, right? Maybe at this point, Sitting Bull doesn't really have a choice but to involve himself in jobs that he doesn't like, right? The idea that are also maybe there's this attempt to sort of conform to the white culture in an attempt to survive, right? So this, you know, this makes outsiders think that the West is a little bit more harmonious than it really is. So here's Buffalo Bill posing with Sitting Bull, so another sort of curious image of the West that, you know, you don't normally see these two types of people posing together. And it might in some ways represent the way that the West was trying to be seen. So let's talk about women in the West. So these are two, you know, if we think about the traditional men in the past, or men in the West from the previous video, we were talking about Jesse James and Billy the Kid. These are two of the more famous portrayals of Western women. First, we have Calamity Jane, which she kind of is a paradox in history because her personality was apparently very kind and compassionate, but she was also really known for her frontierish ways. She oftentimes toured with Buffalo Bill as well. She also oftentimes dressed in men's attire, as we see her here. She was very comfortable with firearms, right? And what's interesting about Calamity Jane is because she took on more of a masculine identity, in a way, she kind of showed that the role of women also sort of revolved around that rugged individualism. So, you know, that kind of sense of frontiersmanship was not, in Calamity Jane's mind, was not just a masculine thing, right? She saw it as an opportunity for women to also embrace their more individual personalities and not kind of conform to the traditions of the East Coast. And then we have Annie Oakley here, who was a female gunslinger. And she started shooting as early as 15. She already had a reputation as a sharpshooter when she was a teenager. And she became famous over time. She became a renowned international star. She actually toured around the world. She would perform for royalty and heads of state in Europe. And so again, it shows us the sort of foreign obsession with the West. And so, you know, even though the West in a lot of ways was a very rough existence for women, some women who sort of embraced that mentality could find their way to fame, right? But one could say that, you know, this was much more rare for Western women. Many of them were, unfortunately, in very difficult occupations in the West because there were not enough, really weren't enough opportunities available. And so, like I was saying earlier, one of the more popular occupations among most women in the West, unfortunately, was prostitution. So what happens to the cowboy, right? As time goes on, there's going to be more pressure to expand railroad networks extensively throughout the South. And so as more railroads are built, what that's going to do is it's going to cut into cattle country, right? So when there are more railroad tracks, there isn't as much of a demand for these long cattle drives. So it's going to put a lot of cowboys out of business, right? Instead of having to bring the cattle to the trains, now the trains can come straight to them. And so what's going to happen is that that more and more cattle grazers are going to be put out of the job. You're also going to find that more and more grazing land is going to be opened up to homesteaders. And as homesteaders start to buy up this land, they're going to fence in their property. And so cattle can no longer graze freely upon it. Think about it like the second enclosure movement, in a way. Sorry, I thought that there was something else in a slide, so I just was sort of sliding through on my own. But in any case, so yeah, it's sort of like Enclosure movement part 2 in a way. Think about the also this what this painting is portraying. What it is in my mind is it's kind of showing us how the romantic image of the West is vanishing. Notice that you have this one sort of well, it's first of all kind of a depressing scene because it's snowy outside. You also see the one cowboy closing off the fence, signaling the end of that kind of grazeland, open, maybe seamlessly endless frontier. The idea is that the frontier is also closing because it's turning into that more traditional private property, more established type of land, right? So how does the West legacy live on? So one of the more problematic environmental consequences of the closing of the frontier, of course, was the slaughter of the buffalo. Buffalo are virtually extinct, right? Before the manifest destiny ideal started to sort of spread out among the American mindset, you had over 35,000 buffalo in the United States. By the time the 20th century rolled around, there were so few that the government couldn't really get an accurate count, right? They were virtually extinct. And so this is really problematic because not only for the buffalo themselves, of course, but for American Indians who depended upon them. One of the more positive outcomes of the expansion into the West is that there are attempts to protect and conserve some of the more beautiful and sort of wondrous parts of the West, right? Yellowstone National Park is going to be the first national park established in the U.S., and it's going to be formed on the early side in 1872, rather. And you're going to have an increased effort to preserve resources and create public parks over time. This is going to become even more of an issue when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, who very much is America's first conservationist president. So you can see here that national parks are going to be much more prominent in the West. They're going to be very large. But national parks, are not completely pristine to American development. Some of these actually are going to be open for recreation, so there is going to be, of course, environmental consequences. And also some of these areas are still subject to some development. You do have some lumber industries that still have access to the forest in these areas. So it's not completely pristine just because it's made into a national park. Conservation essentially is going to be a movement that's going to really emerge in the turn of the 20th century. John Muir was one of the first environmentalists, at least outspoken ones, in United States history. He actually became quite friendly with Teddy Roosevelt, and the two of them embraced the sort of natural wonders that existed throughout the country. And this image of the two of them is kind of showing us their almost worship of nature. But Teddy Roosevelt was a complex figure. Like I said, he was a conservationist, not a preservationist. So even though Teddy Roosevelt loved nature, he was still a hunter, right? He still, did support things that had a negative environmental consequence on the land. But nonetheless, it was a step forward. And also, we're starting to see the creation of actual organizations that have some government sponsorship that are meant to protect the environment. And so the Sierra Club was one of the first, founded in 1892. But increasingly, we're going to see more environmental protectionist groups emerge. And by the 1970s, the environmental policies are going to extend well into the White House. And surprisingly, Richard Nixon is actually going to be the president that creates the Environmental Protection Agency. But nonetheless, environmentalism really does start with Teddy Roosevelt. So that's it for us for the closing of the Western frontier. It's sort of a paradoxical chapter because on the one hand, the West is this kind of romantic image that us East Coasters still, I think, revere in some ways. Going west it's a different mentality. I think we go too fast in the East, right? Go west, young man is still something that people think about, right? The idea that you can almost recreate yourself when you migrate to the West. But nonetheless, if we acknowledge the sort of special place that the West holds for us, we also have to think about all the people that were lost in that recreation of the West, right? So really paying attention to what happens with Native Americans is something for us to acknowledge as we think about how the West transitioned into what it is today. So The next topic that we're going to cover is the populist movement, which involves some agricultural reforms in the late 19th century. So stay tuned for that. We'll start doing that next week. I hope you guys stay safe in this blizzard, and I will see you on Monday. Thanks, guys.